Welcome everyone to this webinar. Today we only have about 30 minutes, so we're going to cover a lot of ground pretty quickly and really give like an overview about successfully innovating with AI agents. This is the first part in a webinar series, and so we'll talk. We have the date of the next one at the end, but we're going to be going in a lot of what we cover. We're going to be breaking up and then going in more depth about in subsequent webinars. But this is a really good grounding and framework for thinking about how you innovate with AI agents. Um, and if you have any questions along the way, feel free to drop them in the chat and we'll do a Q&A session at the end. All right, so let's dive in. Everyone knows that AI agents, there's no shortage of hype. And I think, if you really have spent any time reading or thinking through or looking at 'em, it's clear there's a huge possibility. And yet in 2025, it's really challenging to get these into production. And there was a recent, survey study by Bain Capital around kinda like what's making it hard to get agents into production, and there was a lot that came through from security and privacy, lack of expertise, IP concerns, company readiness, the unproven nature of it, the quality and accuracy of it, just, kind of across the board. And these are all real, right? And I think they're all kind of legitimate concerns, and so we're gonna talk a little bit about, again, the steps towards, developing and rolling these kind of systems out. And we'll touch on some of these concerns along the way and how you can manage and mitigate some of these issues as you push forward. So the basic steps, 5 steps for innovating with agents is like starting with the right strategy. You need to identify which use cases do we want to work on. There's some trade-offs there. You need to obviously have the talent and be ready for it. And we'll talk about that. Then comes actually developing the solution, which in 2025, this is a very new technology, and there's some parts of it that are still pretty finicky and probably will be for the next year or two. Adopting the correct risk and security posture. There's all sorts of considerations around risk and security with these. We'll talk about, and then finally is the deployment phase. When you go live, what do you need to be thinking about as you're going live and rolling it out to a population of users? So the first step, strategy. If you're leading a team that's been tasked with um, delivering some AI solutions, what do you need to think about? And there's a lot of considerations. We could spend the entire 30 minutes just talking about this, but a couple that are really top of mind is number one, when you're talking about your projects. I've led AI at a large Fortune 100 company previously, and one of the number one kind of pieces of advice that I have for people leading AI work streams is, get the right mix of moonshots and layups, as we call it, which is you want to have some kind of low hanging fruit that you can really kind of showcase like the getting to a successful solution and getting it in production, because it's a difficult road, and you want to kind of get more and more buy-in from all the different stakeholders in an organization. But you also don't want it to just be a collection of science projects, right? Because then it doesn't really have the impact, and that's also a problem. So you want to have a mix of those moonshots, which are um, not to say they're unrealistic. I think they're very realistic. Just like we were able to get to the moon successfully, but that things that would be really transformative to the business, right? Looking at the heart of the business. And so one of the easiest ways to identify these really transformative opportunities is just looking around at like what are the significant cost centers in your business? Is it in financial? Is it like an area where you're processing a lot of paperwork with a big team of humans? Customer service is one. We'll use that as an example in today's webinar. That oftentimes, if you have a consumer facing business, that or even a B2B, servicing your customers ends up many times in many businesses being a very large cost center, a very important area to improve quality on as well. And then the last thing I'll throw in there when you're kind of looking for use cases and opportunities is one of the really great success patterns we see is areas where you can start HIDL and transition to HODL. What do those mean? HIDL is human in the loop, and HODL is human on the loop. So if you can find areas where you can seamlessly go from, the AI providing a human expert or some answers and really accelerating their productivity and their ability to execute. But then over time, as you get more comfort, as you improve the system, as you get more data to make the system better, where you can start at letting the system act more autonomously, because that's where the real speed up becomes and the real efficiency gains come. Then you're in good shape. And so for customer service, an example of that is, if you have customer service workers who are answering calls from your users, they can, you can start with, say, the AI sort of listening in and suggesting, hey, this may be the solution to their problem, or this may be the answer they're looking for. And then over time, as you can show that that's really dialed in, then you can start to transition some of your inquiries, some of your customer service calls being directly answered by the AI, and knowing that you've tested it with a human in the loop first, as you transition to human on the loop. Next thing is talent. We've seen a pretty radical change over the last few years in who's building these systems and what they need. And so a few years ago with traditional machine learning, large organizations tend to have these clustered center of excellences, that, had, people with, in many cases, PhDs in math or other related fields. And now, you no longer have to learn how to design the algorithms and train the models and really kind of transform the data and do all that step. You really just need, an API key access to a pre-trained model, and you can start building. And so what we're seeing now is, instead of just having these like very concentrated small pockets of talent that are building with AI, it's much more distributed, much more democratized. And so now any sort of just application development team that's developing with AI. It's just a typical kind of application software developers. Oftentimes, product managers and sometimes business owners are experimenting themselves with, getting involved, rolling up their sleeves, and helping to write and craft prompts and improve prompts. And so it's much more accessible. You do have to be kind of forward leaning and willing to learn and willing to iterate and try. But you don't need a PhD in mathematics anymore to build, and the number of use cases that require kind of custom training or fine tuning is not huge. Sometimes it can be beneficial if you're trying to get the last little bit of performance, but you can do a lot without that. And so that kind of product mindset and, that ability to iterate ends up being really important. And then we get into development, which is the hard part. And so one of the things I always caution people who are working with is, one of the traps I think a lot of people fall into is, you put together a demo that you can showcase to different stakeholders in the organizations or C-suite members, board members, and it's really cool, and it gets everyone excited. And for a demo, as long as it gives these really compelling answers or really compelling operations, 90% of the time, that's great. That's good enough for a demo. The hard part is going to getting it ready into production, where it needs to be 99 or 99.9% accurate, or, at the very least exceed the accuracy of what a human could do at a similar task, given more time. And so there's been no shortage of examples of this, but one of the ones, if anyone, this was from last month at Apple's developer conference, there was a corresponding Wall Street Journal article, and a number of people have been asking, like, when is Siri going to become a little bit more LLM enabled? Clearly, there's like an opportunity there. I think everyone sees it, and there's different, different phone operating systems are coming out with different levels of intelligence, and there's, it's in some ways the perfect device that's ripe for innovation with AI, but yet it's been very gradual. And so the interviewer asked some very pointed questions around, like, why isn't this happening? And the quote was, it didn't converge in the way quality wise that we needed it to. I'm not sure why they phrased it in the past tense. I would have phrased it in the, current, saying it hasn't yet converged in the way, because you don't want to just try the things one time and expect them to work right away and get frustrated if they don't. You just have to recognize that they take some iteration. So, mind the demo to product gap, and we'll talk about some strategies for making that so that you can get through that as quickly as possible. We often call this crossing the chasm, right? Going from amazing demos and pilots and actually getting into production. And so the question, before we get into kind of solutions, let's talk about, like, why it's so hard to cross that chasm. Um, there's a lot of pieces that go into a modern agentic system. And this is a very high level simplification, but it will give you an appreciation for the complexity involved. Everything always starts with the data, right? And so getting your data properly cleaned, if you're scraping old PDFs or other kind of legacy data formats, you need to get that data properly cleaned. You need to get it indexed in some sort of vector capable store. And then when you index it, obviously the choice of embeddings you use to index it with can be very impactful. And there's a lot of options out there. Context engineering. So when you're even if you have just a simple like RAG copilot, the way you sort of the strategy you employ to retrieve information from the vector store, where you want to treat like everything from like which information is being retrieved to what's the right amount. Am I retrieving too little, too much? As I fill in the context, that helps the LLM answer the question or the task that it's been given. And then making sure it's all exposed in an agentic friendly interface. So you probably heard a lot of the buzz around MCP and as well as some other protocols. And, as more and more of the data in an enterprise gets exposed in these friendly protocols, that allows you to, that kind of forms some of the building blocks for really being able to innovate with agents. And then the tools, which are kind of the building blocks for these agentic systems that allow you to perform certain tasks, like on behalf of an end user. There's a lot of challenging work to making sure those are correct, making sure they're properly scoped and defined, so you can have a tool for um, different actions you might want to take. So in customer servicing, maybe you want to be able to update an end user's account to reflect the conversation, or you want to be able to escalate to a human agent. Right? There's like different kinds of tools that you'd want. You need to have the appropriate security model around those. Are they inheriting security settings from the end user? Do they have their own kind of security and privileges? There's a lot of choices that goes into doing that properly. And then at the application layer, obviously, you're endlessly kind of iterating with modifying your prompts. Which models do you want to use? Do I need to use, there's certain vendors that are better for my application than others? Do I need to use a big expensive model that's kind of slow, or can I get away with something that's less expensive and much faster? And will that still give satisfactory answers? Orchestrating it all. There's a lot that's going into agentic orchestration right now. There's some really cool dynamic frameworks that allow essentially at runtime for the system to decide which tools it needs to call and what order they need to call, how to chain them together dynamically, and all that kind of level of autonomy in terms of the planning phase for executing on requests also brings a lot of chaos. It's very finicky right now, I'd say in mid 2025. We recommend to our customers that if you can, use deterministic linking of these tools and sort of have like very prescribed sequences, you'll have much more reliable systems. A lot of the dynamic orchestration, it's tricky to work with and really takes a higher level of effort to get it to work consistently. And then memory, this is an increasingly common pattern, which is, as people are interacting with these systems, you wanna have some degree of memory, both from, if you're like, if I'm using them, my interactions with the system, as well as it's helpful to sometimes have memory of, like, other people's interactions with the system as well, and that way, if there are times when it takes me 2 or 3 times asking for something to get to the right answer, by implementing some memory system, in there, hopefully the next time someone comes in with a similar request, they can draw on previous conversations and get to the right result much more quickly. And then on top of that, you need, security and guardrails around this whole thing, because there's also, we'll talk about that in a little bit. There's a lot of ways they can go wrong. And then, you wouldn't want to put these into production without the right level of observability and kind of monitoring and continuously evaluating them to make sure they continue to give good answers because, as we'll talk about in a minute, these systems aren't static. They change and they evolve over time, and user behavior also changes over time, and all those things need to be accounted for. So let's talk a little bit about the solution here. I'd say the state of a lot of Gen AI development right now, there's a heavily reliance on vibes, and whether it's vibe coding or vibe evaluations is what we often see as people are developing. As a developer is writing prompts and building these applications, they're oftentimes very much looking at they have a few favorite queries or requests they like to ask the system as they go along to try to do that vibe check. And the by far the biggest gain we've seen, among our users and, like, the biggest kind of, secret to going from the demo phase to, performance ready is to actually invest a little bit of time up front in developing an eval suite. What do we mean by that? Essentially, it's kinda like unit testing for Gen AI applications, but the way you do it is, implemented the details are actually a little bit different than sort of traditional software, unit testing, and so you generate this eval suite, and what that does is it allows you to iterate very quickly as you're going through and making changes. You can see across a battery of tests that cover a full range of potential scenarios how those changes you're making are improving. Because in many cases, what happens is, a change might improve like 75% of the tests, but then like there's a couple where that perform worse. And the quicker, having that immediate feedback loop allows you to really kind of move quickly as you're developing. This is just some examples of screenshots of the way, people can leverage our platform to do evals. And, you can see on the right, over time, you want more green and less red, as you run through your test suites. And you want to be able to track those experiments as you go through it. And, as you change all the variables we talked about in the anatomy of an agentic AI application from your tool calls and your prompts and all those things, you wanna be able to understand, like, over time, how your performance is improving. Alright, next section, we talked about risk and security. And so there's been as people have been pushing to get these things into production, we've seen a lot of failure modes, let's call it. And so this one was just from a couple days ago. There was a scenario, where Replit there was a user building something with Replit, a team, and, at some point, Replit's coding agent deleted their entire production database and their code base as well. And so it was pretty catastrophic. And then there was also some weirdness around the agent sort of initially trying to deny it before admitting it made a mistake. The CEO of Reddit of Replit rather has come forward and kind of acknowledged that it was a pretty catastrophic error, and they actually had his development team working over the weekend to implement some appropriate guardrails. Um, but one of the things and then there was another one actually with Supabase, where they had an MCP interface. Supabase is a database provider, and they were really pushing into being like very agentic AI friendly, and so they launched an MCP interface for their database. And unfortunately, it didn't have the right security controls in place, and so developers were able to construct queries and interactions that would allow it to expose other people's data, which is if you're a SaaS database provider, that's not where you wanna be in the news for. And so we think a lot about, with guardrails, how do you stay off the front page, right? Like what's the what you that's the you don't want to get attention for those reasons. Um, in addition to like those kind of security concerns, there's a lot around do I want my data going outside of my data center or my cloud account? Am I comfortable with the risk that my data could be used for training? Different LLM providers will have different EULAs and things like that around it. And then what guardrails do I need to actively enforce acceptable use policies and security and ensure acceptable behavior by my system so that, if I'm rolling out some public facing system, I'm not the next person on the front page of the paper. And so, there's different systems for putting these guardrails in place, but you want to have things like this is just an example video reel of the way our customer would use our system to add guardrails around actively blocking for specific kinds of PII. And so, depending on the nature of your system, you're going to want to have checks in place for, in this case, this is toxicity. So, in a customer service agent, you want to make sure that there's not toxicity going into or out of the system. Same thing with PII. There may be types of PII that are necessary for an application, like a phone number or a name, but there's other types like banking numbers, which maybe you shouldn't have flowing through your system. And so, having a flexible guardrail system where you can go through and put these kind of these security measures, and also things like prompt injection, is really important. And like we're seeing a lot in the early days, a lot of teams we're trying to kind of construct their own one at a time and really making sure you have a comprehensive security suite around this stuff is super important as these agents have a lot of autonomy. And so you want to make sure that you're not opening up, uh, you know, vulnerabilities as you push into agentic AI. And then, the last thing, so let's say you've done all those things, you've found the come up with the right strategy, you have the right talent, you've started to develop, you've gotten your test suite in, you've really got the application working really well where you feel confident about putting it out into the world, and you've mitigated the risks that are necessary. The last big step is deploying, right? Pushing it out into the world, going into production. And the thing that we talk about with people is, with traditional software applications, you kind of push them out into production. Maybe you find a few bugs and you fix them, but then generally, there may be some upgrades depending on the. Sometimes they're upgraded, but other times, teams kind of move on to the next project and work on the next project. And with AI systems, you definitely need to have that kind of continual monitoring and improvement type of loop in place. These systems aren't static. Number one, the underlying models that they're resting on, whether it's OpenAI or Anthropic or any Llama models, they're constantly updating, and in the name of improvement, and they are getting better. But that doesn't mean that some of those updates won't introduce kind of unintended behaviors into your system. That happens all the time. And so just because it was working well, today doesn't mean it's going to be working perfectly tomorrow. On the whole, it'll be getting better, but there may be some unwanted behaviors that are introduced. And similarly, the uh, the um, uh, the user behaviors, right? The types of things users are trying to do with these systems as people get more comfortable using AI and using agentic AI systems. I think they start to realize they can do more and more, and they can leverage them more for additional things. And so, you want to make sure that you're paying attention to how people are using and how these systems are evolving by monitoring them closely. And so, having some sort of framework and dashboard in place where you can um, on the left, you see like a typical alerting. So if you find thresholds or certain metrics that are being exceeded that you don't want exceeded, and monitoring quality of service. And these can be like basic out of the box things like how well did this LLM answer a question, or how readable was the end result, to like very use case specific metrics like ones where you validate sort of answers against internal databases that it was correct, or that you have particular sort of policies that you want to make sure it's adhering to, monitoring those types of domain specific evals. And then on the right, you'll see an example of something we're really big on too, which is um, helping our customers measure the AI's impact on overall business performance and KPIs, right? And so, if you're a customer service center, you want to get you want to make sure people get good answers as quickly as possible, and you want to also be conscious of costs, right? And so, if you're monitoring like how fast can we resolve trouble tickets with customer tickets, you want to see that as your AI gets better and smarter and is able to handle more of the traffic autonomously, you want to see that going down. And you also want to see the quality of the service, like customer satisfaction, and those kind of things go up over time. And so really kind of like as you're tracking, all these different notions of model and system performance, really making sure that there's a grounded in business performance as well. So I'll just wrap up with, 4 of the keys, like, if I'd say across the whole process, like, what we see is, like, the keys to this. One is we talked about, in the strategy side, mixing moonshots and layups, right? So choosing projects that are choosing some where you can have some quick wins, is really helpful in terms of getting the rest of the stakeholders in the organization excited and on board and overcoming naysayers. But you also wanna have some things that are really transformative to the business, because that's ultimately, like, how you're gonna transform, and long term, that's what makes you successful, is doing things that, like, actually have a real ROI from a business perspective and allow you to do things you maybe weren't able to do before, and that's what gives you a competitive advantage. Garbage in, garbage out. This is, we talked about data being the foundation of everything. That hasn't changed even with this new form of AI. Um, and so making sure you have your data kind of well cleaned, accessible via, MCP and the right retrieval strategies and really tuning that. Oftentimes, if you don't do a good job of that, then the kind of problems that introduces tend to propagate throughout the system and create a lot of problems down the road. Third, moving beyond vibes, right? So getting that really systematic in terms of your ability to evaluate the performance of these. It's a new science, and it's something people are really having to scale the learning curve on. But we help people with this all the time. And when you're able to implement this successfully, and once your team's kind of familiar with doing this, it really unlocks the ability to move quickly and actually have a huge impact with agents. And so this one's, like, just massive and probably where we're spending, the majority of our time right now with our customers and where they're seeing the most value is, um, moving beyond vibes and getting really kind of, systematic around this level of improvement and getting into production. And then the last one is to stay off the front page, right? So, manage the risks we talked about, whether it's security risks or, toxicity or hallucinations or PII data. There's a whole host of new risks these systems introduce. And so making sure you have an automated governance and guardrails type of solution in place that's systematic, where you can apply, certain security controls you're going to want to apply organization wide. Others are very use case specific and you want to be able to apply those granularly, but have that kind of framework in place so that you're not just, plugging holes as leaks emerge, because that's what ends you up on the front page of the paper. So, I mentioned at the beginning, this is the first part. This is kind of the overview, intro for a series of AI webinars. Be on the lookout. We'll announce the dates of the next few coming up. They'll be, smaller in scope, but more in depth, which I think is really helpful. There's a lot more detail in here that I didn't have the time to get to that we were going to cover. And, if there's anything that Arthur we can do to be helpful, certainly reach out, to either through our website or through, our emails. My email is just ab@arthur.ai. Always happy to field requests. And with that, I think we have just enough time. Oh, we're at 12:30. Wow, time flew. Maybe we can answer one or two questions if people can stay a little longer.
Yeah, I think, there's one that's come in, it's basically, besides domain-specific evals, what other recommendations do you have for finishing off the last 10%?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's like rigorous testing and iteration is like the overall umbrella. I think domain specific or evals and domain specific evals are the biggest piece of that. Um, but it's that kind of rigorous iteration, getting each part of that stack that we talked about for agents. You need to make sure each of those sections is dialed in, and so you just need to go methodically through the overall each piece of that and make sure starting with the data and going through each piece to make sure that it's working well.